Dr. Christine Malsbary began her academic career as an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She is currently a visiting professor in the Social Foundations of Education program at Vassar College. Christine earned her bachelor's in art history from Temple University. She received a master's degree in anthropology of art and visual culture from the University of London. She also has a master's degree in education and a K-12 credential in TESOL, or Teaching of English to Speakers of Other Languages, which she earned at City University of New York. And in 2012, Dr. Malsbary received her PhD in Social Sciences and Comparative Education from UCLA. Christine's research on educational equity in context of new immigrant urban diversity has strong implications for reform with goals of pluralist, multilingual, and racially just outcomes. Dr. Malsbary has received funding for her research from foundations including the Fulbright Hayes and the Association of American University of Women. Oh, you got it, I'm tired. Association of American University Women. In 2014, Christine was awarded a Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. For that project, she conducted long-term ethnography on the ways in which teachers negotiate, adapt, and resist policy reform in highly diverse immigrant, multilingual schools in New York City. Dr. Malsbary has published her research in journals focused on qualitative research methods, pedagogy, and the anthropology of education. A sample of some of her journal article titles will give you a sense of her interest, and I just want to read them. Will This Hell Never End? Substantiating and Resisting Race Language Policies in a High School was published in Anthropology and Education Quarterly.
A kid said that.
I love it. I'm saying it now. You should quote me. And it's not just learning English, it's learning other cultures. Belonging, Power, and Possibility in an Immigrant Contact Zone, which was published in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. So we're very eager to hear about your research, so please welcome Christine Malsbary.
Well, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, Susan. I'm just super excited to be here. I think that Boulder is widely recognized as a place that's both really special and also interested in rigorous work and deep thinking, and also really interested in qualitative work. And so being here with you and getting to share my research with you is really, it just is super special for me. So I appreciate that. This is a working title, Kickin' It in the Transcultural City. I'm playing with it as a book title. You'll tell me if it works with the talk. So I want to start out by just kind of locating what I do and who I am. At UCLA, when I was a graduate student, there was a saying floating around, if you scratch a theory, you find a biography. So I grew up in immigrant communities. My dad's a professor. My mom doesn't believe in formal schooling. She's a former hippie. She's still a hippie. And we moved a lot. We moved between 3 countries, lots of cities, and a couple of different languages. So I grew up in Toronto. When I was 12, we moved to Germany. I was put in German public schools. I didn't speak any German, so I had that, experience of learning German from my peers, right? From them teaching me, and also that kind of confusion and dislocation and sense of belongingness that gets fractured when you're doing a lot of moving. And so I studied the arts, as was discussed, and when I was 25, I was sort of trying to figure out how I was going to make money as an artist, and I wound up teaching ESL in the South Bronx, and was immediately had a heart connection to these young people who also, like me, were living transnational lives. And so that's really where this comes from. I was an ESL teacher for 4 years in New York, went to do my PhD, and have kind of continued my transnational journeys ever since. I like to think about my work as an archaeology of a cultural context, right? So I'm really thinking about particular kinds of spaces where kids come from all over the world. A lot of the schools that I'm working in have students coming from 60 to 90 different countries, speaking over 30 different languages. And I'm just interested in what happens in those kinds of spaces. What do people do? How do kids learn? How does policy impact these particular kinds of places? And I want to really quickly mention here that these hyperdiverse cultural contexts are not only located in Los Angeles and New York City, right? So these hyperdiverse spaces are all over the United States. They are in the mountains of rural North Carolina. They're right here in Colorado. They're everywhere, and but they're invisible, right? They're not as widely kind of talked about or thought about. And then I also want to pose that these kinds of spaces are in spaces that we may think of as bilingual, bicultural, right? That underneath this kind of label of English-Spanish bilingualism, that there actually is a lot of hyperdiversity and transnationalism happening, right? So you may speak Spanish, but in the class are kids from Chile and Costa Rica and El Salvador and various parts of Mexico, and they may speak indigenous languages like Quechua, and they are themselves assimilating into a Spanish-speaking culture, right? So I want to kind of break down what we're thinking about when we think about hyperdiversity. But my work is also an archaeology of a political context and certainly of a policy context, right? So just as this kind of globalization from below leads to fervent and creative and interesting and experimental practices and ways of being, kids and teachers are also working and living and dreaming in what is a very tough world right now, right? Which is a very tough world. And in New York, we have not yet passed the DREAM Act, right? So we're still waiting for that legislation to go through. So my inquiry is, what do culture, community, and context look like in hyperdiverse, multilingual, transcultural new immigrant spaces? I think about classrooms as a mirror of society, and so I'm always thinking about what are the kinds of things that happen in classroom and what do they show us about these larger social phenomena. And so of course I'm very interested in things like race and racism and linguistic discrimination. And then of course also spaces that are subject to district policy. And then I think about how to examine these kinds of places as an anthropologist of education, and not simply someone who does ethnography, but someone who claims the title of anthropologist. And so when I define what anthropologist means to me, because people define these in lots of different ways, I really think about long-term field work. And this has been an evolving definition. It's been, we grow into our academic identities, and certainly I've grown into mine. So I think about long-term field work, and I think about actually using lots of different kinds of tools and techniques to study culture, right? So anthropologists study culture, and what I tell my undergraduates is that culture is what people do, culture is what people say, culture is what people believe and what people produce or make. And then of course we have to think about how people interpret their own actions. How do they think about what they're saying and what they're doing? And so the research question that is really coalesced across my body of research and a couple of different projects is what do recent arrival immigrant youth, so I'm mostly looking at youth who have been in the country for less than 4 years, adolescents, and their teachers do say, believe, and produce to negotiate these kinds of spaces, these multilingual, hyper-diverse contexts. And so I looked at this in my dissertation study, which was entitled Belonging in a Multilingual, Multi-Ethnic High School, and at that point I still hadn't become acquainted with theories of superdiversity and some of the theories that now frame my work. And so I was even puzzling about how to talk about these kinds of places, right? And in a subsequent piece looking at learning and teaching in superdiversity, and then in my current work, which Susan discussed and introduced to you so nicely, so thank you for that, Teachers as Policymakers. So I'm going to go through each of these projects, and I will kind of point out places where I think I might want to talk more, you might want to have questions, but of course we can talk about any of these things. So my dissertation research was in a comprehensive, large high school in the greater Los Angeles area that I sometimes call Guadalupe High and sometimes call Faulkner High, because I was reading William Faulkner at the time and it felt poetic. Coming up with pseudonyms is, of course, a whole thing. I did one of these kind of more traditional 18-month school-based ethnographies, right? So my site of analysis was the school, and I was focused on youth practices. I selected the school because it was one of the most diverse schools in the greater Los Angeles area. It was in an upper middle to middle class neighborhood. It was very traditional in the sense that while there was racial diversity at the school, there wasn't a lot of linguistic diversity, right? So the new immigrant kids were put into one of these ESL programs that's at the end of a long hallway with teachers who no one pays attention to, and they kind of did their own thing out there, and I went and spent some time with them. 97% of the population was designated as English language learner. And of that, most spoke Spanish, although as we just discussed, you know, this notion of kind of the Spanish-speaking population within that is also a lot of diversity. So these are my data sources, and I'll just let you kind of surf your eyes over those. I'm not going to get too much into my visual and art-based stuff, just to kind of keep some coherence, but I do want to point out that I use art as a method, and I'm happy to kind of talk a little bit more about that if you want to in the question and answer. And I had two major findings, one of which I've been working on publishing for quite some time, and that is that youth engage in what I'm terming transcultural repertoires of practice, and I've really grappled with that term and wondered if, you know, if I really can assert that there's some kind of transcultural practice, and isn't it just a cultural practice, right? So I welcome thinking with you about that. So youth engage in these transcultural repertoires of practice, and youth also produce language policy, and they do this in order to accomplish something. And what that is they're accomplishing a sense of belonging, right? So they're trying to belong across linguistic, national origin, and racial difference. And in addition to, by virtue of the fact that they are excluded, or were excluded in the larger school community. Teachers also were doing things in this space, and they also believed in belonging and thought that was important for their students, but they found themselves very restricted, and what they found themselves restricted by were these regimes of accountability, right? So testing policy and other kinds of policy. And so that surfaced in my dissertation, and then I kind of put that piece away for a while, and it comes back later, obviously, in my work. So I'm going to dig into this transcultural repertoires of practice piece that came out a little bit with you. And so this is work by Gutierrez and Rogoff, that's supposed to be a 2003 piece that they published called Cultural Repertoires of Practice, where they define culture as community organized approaches, actions, interests, learning taken up by students in classroom, and also this definition by Ava Lamb, who does really, really fascinating work on transnationalism and youth and literacy. I love this ways of acting and participating in diverse social groups and the heterogeneous sets of knowledge, skills, and competence that are acquired in the process. And so what I found in my work was that youth were engaging in assistance practices in order to both help kids, each other, assimilate into U.S. school, but also assimilate into a hyper-diverse cultural context. So they had these two things going on, right? They hadn't all come from hyper-diverse cultural contexts, and so they were learning how to do that and learning how to do U.S. school. And so they did this resource pulling where they pulled on what they knew, on their competencies, their knowledge, their being in this space in order to help each other really come to belong. And here is a little bit from an interview I did with a boy from Korea who talked about some of the assistance practices, and he says, when I came here, some other Asian friends were helping me. Ann Lee, she's Filipino, she helped me a lot. And so here you see that this kind of pan-Asian identity emerged in this space, right? So that the kids, and it emerged through pop culture, which was really interesting, right? They had a lot of like the same stars in common, like the stars in Japan and the stars in Korea, like they all knew their names, and that's how they got to be friends. And yet, of course, they're all speaking different languages, right? So she helped me a lot. When I first came in, I didn't really understand what they said, pass this paper. I did not understand at all. She would help me to understand. I'm watching the process like imitating. And so this imitating piece came back for me in later work. So he continues to explain. I'll just let you read over that. She knew what it was like. And so that's some of the assistance practices that I'm calling transcultural that I saw in the space. And another practice that I saw is what I'm calling comparative knowing. And so I saw that kids were sharing a lot with each other, things that they knew from their home countries, and they would do these comparisons. And this came out in an interview where one of the young people was helping me. He was working as a translator for me during the interview, and the two kids started getting into this conversation about, I can't remember what it was like traffic patterns and all the festivals that they used to have in their home countries. And so I began to kind of think about this comparative knowing, and I noticed that kids would compare how poverty works. They would compare religious tolerance, intolerance, violence, war, gender relations, right? Both across the places that they had come from and then also in comparison to the United States. And so this is obviously a resource, a way of knowing, a way of being in the world that is generated from the migratory process, right? So thinking about that as a transcultural practice. And here's Amna, I'll let you read that. So it's really through her embodied practice of migration, through her migratory experience, that she has this awareness of the economics of migration, right? The teacher I interviewed this past year said, these kids are immigration specialists. That's what they do, right? They're specialists in this thing, in immigration and globalization, which I find really interesting. And I think it has a lot of implications for pedagogy, right, that we can talk about. So I want to get a little bit into the methodological challenges and also the affordances that I faced in doing this early project and how it's pushed me methodologically over time. So here I am, I'm in this classroom, I speak English and German, there were no immigrants from Germany, and a little bit of Spanish, right? So I knew enough Spanish to like write down what kids were saying. I did not speak Urdu, right? Like I didn't speak Farsi, I didn't speak Portuguese, there were all sorts of things that I didn't speak that the kids were speaking around me. And so what happened in my field notes is I realized that I really was privileging English and Spanish and unable to capture some of the other things that were happening. And so I began to wonder if writing field notes was really the way to go about this thing, given that I couldn't necessarily get these accurate representations. And so I, in the next project, was pushed to video, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The other thing that happened is that I had transcripts from interviews that I did where youth were translating for me. And I was able to obviously write up the English, but I couldn't write up other languages, for example, Farsi, and I was a broke graduate student. And so what I did is I went to my friends and I said, can you translate this for me and I'll do something for you, right? So we began to do these trades. And I would get these transcripts where people would be making notes like, I think this is what she's saying, and this is how I would translate that. And so all of a sudden I realized I had these community-produced transcripts, right? Which also kind of brings you into these interesting questions about knowledge and representation and power, and who is producing this. So I want to dig into that a little bit more, and I'm going to fast forward us into a little sub-project that I did in the spring of 2015. While I was looking at teachers as policymakers, I stole Alistair Pennycook's method of giving microphones, audio mics, to people who speak a variety of different languages. And I did this because I wanted to more accurately think about and represent youth's multilingual repertoires of practice, right? So what do kids do? And I'm calling these and I'm calling these audio focal follows. So I put a lavalier mic. It took me a long time to figure out how to actually do this technically, and I had some help from people who are documentary filmmakers, which was really interesting. I put lavalier mics on and I attached them to microphones and I slipped them into kids' pockets and I put batteries in and I said, let's run it, right? So I'd meet them at the beginning of the day and they would just keep the mic until it either they got sick of it and wanted to take it off. Other things happened with the microphones as well. Some of them went for walks in the city, some of them disappeared. I mean, there was a lot of things that happened with the microphones. One kid was into the project and he always brought his mic back, and I ended up with an 11-hour day of his talk across multiple kinds of spaces. And so this is a piece that I'm really excited about and really thrilled about, that I'm working on with Marjorie Orellana at UCLA and a couple of students, looking at this young man's talk over a variety of activity spaces. So, he went to school in the morning, then he left, he went to his internship in a law office with a couple of other immigrant peers from school. He's on the New York City subway, so you hear language happening in the city around him. The lavalier mics picked up a lot. It was very interesting. Then they go to Chinatown. That's my favorite part. It's so fascinating. And then he goes home. And he's doing a lot of stuff with the language, right? So he's joking in Spanish. He calls someone a bitch in Russian, we think. A Polish friend teaches him some Polish. He's speaking in French to a classmate from Nepal. And then he's also doing this interesting metalinguistic stuff, right? Like that, we talk about that metalinguistic awareness where he's talking about Simglish, which is this language spoken by some characters in some kind of video. I'm not familiar with this video game.
Yeah, I know that language.
You know Simglish?
Yeah.
Oh, deep.
We can talk.
That's fascinating. Okay, so here's what I mean by a community-produced transcript. So here's my attempt at making sense of what's happening in these different spaces, and I'm writing things in, and wonders of wonders, I have a research assistant at Vassar who actually speaks most of the languages that this kid speaks, right? So she also grew up in these new immigrant contexts, and she speaks English, Spanish, French, and Russian, as does this kid that I mic. So that, first of all, blows my mind. So here's me trying to make some sense out of stuff, and here's her responding to me. I think this is his first example of non-English, non-Spanish, but what about the Spanish-Portuguesing, right? So I missed that entirely. She picked up on some kind of Spanish-Portuguesing, right? I don't know, there's something happening with a list of people that maybe we don't want to know about. And then I love this comment. Either I'm not understanding his Russian or I have no idea what this language is, right? So obviously bringing us back to this question as we're working as researchers in these kinds of spaces, how do we really represent what's happening in terms of our access to what young people are actually doing? And I want to say quickly that language here is a hook for thinking about culture, right? So clearly there's a lot of transculturalism happening. It surfaces most obviously in language, and so that's an entryway point into kind of a lot of these other issues around culture. Okay, so we talked about how I was documenting the assistance practices in my dissertation and how I was writing field notes and wanted to dig deeper into aspects of learning in these kinds of spaces, and decided to do a video-based project. And so I went to a small high school in New York City. I'll just tell you, it was in Queens, which is, if you're familiar with Queens, is just like, woo, it's off the charts in terms of hyperdiversity. And was there for about 8 weeks, looking specifically at a curricular project that the teachers had put into place called Old Man in the Sea Project. So they were reading Hemingway. These are 9th and 10th graders who were like newly immigrated to the country, right? So the teacher was having them read Hemingway because of a lot of her social justice stance around like the rigor and level of curriculum that's being given to kids in ESL spaces. And the biology teacher was looking at the ocean and the ocean ecology, and then the art teacher was having them draw plankton. So it was a really, really fascinating project. And here's the data sources. They gave the kids cameras. It didn't work out so well. Maybe another project. So some of the things, or the key finding that I found in this project is that teachers and youth were participating in apprenticeship learning to mediate the multilingual hyperdiversity. And this is just about to come out. I published this with some students at the University of Hawaii. So youth were imitating one another. They were watching each other to try and figure out what to do and how to do it. And in their imitation and in their support of one another, in their apprenticeship, they were actually moving back and forth between positions of novice to expert, right? So we talk a lot about kids being novices and them becoming experts, but what was fascinating to me about this, how context impacts learning and the process of learning, is that no one in this space can ever be expert at everything, not even the teacher, right? And so because the teacher could not be expert, that's part of the reason why youth were doing all of this really fascinating peer teaching and peer assistance work. And so I contend that this hyperdiversity really leads to a particular kind of democracy in this space. I also had a little bit of a visual ethnography project going at the same time, which we can talk about later if you want to. So here are the young people, and what I did was I decided to study this girl here, who I'm calling Liana, and I observed her. We went through the videos together, my students and I, and we looked at what she was doing over time. And what I found in terms of methods, that video was great, but I did lose some things because of video, right? And one of the things that I lost was the feel that you get just being in a classroom, because I was making sure that videos were not breaking down, right? And I was carrying a lot of equipment on the New York City subway, and I was trying to make sure the audio was working. There was a couple of times when I was able to step back, and there were some fascinating things that happened, right? So as I was standing in this classroom just sort of being, I noticed that there was this incredible multilingual hum, right? I was calling the multilingual hum that was coming from the young people. And this was a really great analytical point for me, because what I realized was there was no silence ever. Great, so what's happening? Why is there no silence ever? Well, because the kids are talking to each other constantly as the teacher's, so the teacher's teaching and the kids are teaching and everything's happening at the same time, and it works, right? It's like productive chaos, right? So that was something I was able to get by simply being in the space and taking field notes, but I lost that I then went into the video, right? So these kinds of choices about how to capture things, I think, are really interesting. But the videos did really lend themselves to being able to be more accurate and to count things, and the counting practices became really important for me. So that little cross is a 10 count. Teachers also really liked this, right? This was one of those things that I was able to bring back and say to teachers, like, I know you want the kids to work together, and like, guess what? They really are, because here we go, 60 times they're asking each other questions, and only 13 times they're asking you questions, right? So what you want to do is actually working. We also looked at how much kids were interacting with peers across ethno-linguistic groups or from the same ethno-linguistic groups, and we saw that it's almost similar, but also a little bit different. And so I just like this because I like that as an anthropologist I get to do kind of like quanti type things. Like, it's not like really quant, but like I do get to count things, and I think that's fun. Beyond counting, I'm not sure my math can hold up, but I was a student with interrupted formal education. So returning to this notion of the affordances of long-term fieldwork, right? So I noticed this imitating that was happening in the dissertation, and then again when I began to watch Liana, and as I tracked her over, I looked at her over these 7 different classes, I saw her moving, I saw her beginning her kind of learning by imitating one of her peers, by doing this kind of mimicking work, and then beginning to assist another student. And then at the end of all of this, she's kind of shifting into mutual reliance, where she's imitating, she's relying on others, but she's also helping other students access the curriculum as well, and participating in the public space of the classroom by raising her hand and answering questions. And so here are some of the field notes that I created from the video, or possibly my students created them, we created them. And I want to talk a little bit here about the challenges of representing now the hyperdiverse context, and some pushback that we got in some of our writing. And so obviously when we're simply representing English, we don't have a lot of challenges, but then we've got the kids speaking in Spanish, and we made the decision not to translate the Spanish. I felt that what was being said was, I don't know how to put it, like basic enough that folks could like move to a Google Translate situation if they wanted to. We felt that just in the politics of representation, the over-reliance on English and producing English text was in some ways not respectful of commitments that we make to the communities that we work with. So it's a small thing, but it was meaningful to us to not translate, and certainly people make different choices, and I might make different choices at different times in my career, but that's what I chose to do here. The other thing that we really struggled with was how to represent their emerging talk in a way that was ethical. And so I think this is not actually in the final piece that's being published. I think I changed it back to why that, TH, right? But we really went back and forth about this, and it was actually one of my students who grew up as a Spanish speaker who said, like, no, like, I want us to write out use kind of more emergent dialectical language because it shows the respect that was in this space, right? And so in this space, in this classroom, kids could just produce language, right? It was like no big thing. Like there was a sense of safety there. So that was her argument, and we went back and forth about that quite a bit. Just again, kind of a note about like the affordances of long-term field work and what happens when you stay in the field a lot. During my Teachers as Policy Makers project, the teachers came to me and said, we need you to help me out, or us out, and I said, sure, what do you need me to do? And they said, we're going to give you 2 11th grade girls and we want you to create an internship for them. And I said, oh my goodness, how am I going to do this? So I decided that they would do what I did, and so they did a little mini research project on the 9th and 10th grade, and this is their pie chart that they made, and they looked at how kids were helping each other and how kids were resource pooling, and they did this fabulous survey with the 9th and 10th graders. And also interesting, what happens in school, the changes over time, right? So now kids are using the iPhone and the iPad to do their Google translating and all of these different things, which wasn't happening, of course, when I was doing my dissertation, but is happening now. The imitating piece was super controversial, right? Like they asked kids about copying other kids' work, and the kids were like, no, we don't copy, that's wrong, right? And so we were talking, the girls and I were talking about like, oh, but imitating is learning, right? So like you watch your mom cook, and then you try to cook, or your dad cook, right? So a little piece there. Okay, so that brings us pretty current to Teachers as Policymakers, which is the study that I'm currently involved in, and I think I'm wrapping it up. I'm not totally sure. I'm still collecting data in between teaching 3 classes, which is an interesting thing to do. So I, again, went back to my question of what do recent arrival immigrant youth and their teachers do, say, believe, produce, right? And I'm thinking about producing policy in order to negotiate the multilingual, hyperdiverse context. It was a challenging study to think through how to look at policy from a lived perspective, from a lived experience, anthropologically. And so what I decided to do was to really focus in on this 11th grade team of teachers, and I ended up following one class, Class J, and the way the school was structured, that was possible. It was a high school, but the kids didn't change classes, they stayed together. And so I followed Class J, I sort of embedded myself with them. I tried to make it a little simpler. I just brought one camera, right, handheld this time, and tried to take the field notes and to do things a little bit differently. And so really I was looking at policy from the student perspective up. I moved with Class J into the 12th grade, where I'm now looking and talking with 12th grade teachers. While I was doing this study, New York City initiated massive policy reform. So in the last 2 to 3 years, everything has changed. I think probably the thing that people are struggling with the most is the Charlotte Danielson framework for teaching, right? So the teacher evaluation has been really tough, particularly for teachers who are working with immigrant young people, right? Because from their perspective, this teacher evaluation rubric does not take into account the kinds of things that they do specifically with their students. Also, testing has now become Common Core aligned, and so that's happening like right now. And there's a lot of stuff going on, like the city will give the Common Core math regents, and the students don't do well, and then the city comes back and says, okay, well, you can just do the regular regents. And so there's a lot of upheaval and changes, and teachers are attempting to both protect and take care of their students while they are negotiating all of these changes, and that lengthy acronym is about the ESL testing. I also went to some different schools So it was primarily in one site. But I would hear about, teacher policy making things happening, and so I'd hop off to a community organizing meeting, or I'd hop off to another school and do some interviews. I got kind of interested in the opt-out of testing, teacher activism stuff. This is from year 1. I don't know what I have for year 2. I've been dumping it onto a hard drive, and hopefully have time to go over that this summer. As I said, I come from an anthropology of policy approach, which is really looking at lived experiences, and my interest in this project is the conflict between standards-based policy reform on one hand and ethno-cultural linguistic diversity pushing up on the other hand, right? And so this creates this kind of fault line, and I believe the teachers are living in this fault line, and so I wanted to know how they were negotiating that, how are they everyday policymakers, and to what effect. The major coding analytical work that I've been able to do up until this point has been some discourse analysis work, and this was really, really fun. So I noticed while I was in the field that teachers kept saying, well, we know our students, right? And I wondered, like, do they really know their students, right? So then I looked at a variety of teacher meetings where they would talk about the kinds of things that they knew about their students, right? So they knew that their students were there without their parents. They knew that their students were living by themselves and cooking for themselves, right? They knew that their students had particular kinds of learning issues. They knew which students were undocumented. They knew how the students were doing in all of their different classes because they worked in these teacher teams, and they knew about their literacy issues on the one hand and their language issues on the other hand and their content issues, right? So teachers really deeply knew their students, and I also noted that this phrase was a form of resistance, right? So you don't know our students, we know our students. And so for me, this really also speaks to Dumas's work on policy as suffering, and how in this lived experience that folks can really suffer. And I just want to point out that we've been kind of talking about this for a while, right? So Pauline Littman was doing some work 20 years ago where she was talking about external policy makers not paying attention to teachers' classroom-based wisdom, and I would argue, and this is a little bias that I have, that like even more importantly to listen to teachers when they're working in a hyper-diverse cultural context, given the lack of empirical research and pedagogical knowledge, published curricula on these kinds of places, right? I found, going through my work, that teachers were doing 3 things around policy. I always work in 3s. I tried so hard to find a 4th thing, you guys. I really did. There were 3. As of right now, maybe I'll find a 4th so I can get out of my 3s. I underlined negotiate just to tell you that I think that this is the area I'm going to start to push into. I've been working on the resistance stuff, but the negotiation stuff, the adapting, right, is really fascinating as well, and the ways that they're kind of adapting policy in order to protect and to continue doing what they're doing. So that's kind of where I'm going next. But what I've done so far is this case study on teachers' resistance of external policy and their actual test resistance, right? So I documented teachers who refused to administer a test to that the district had given them. And what I found is that they're doing that because teachers are producing their own policies, right? They have their own policies in place, and so what's happening is that the external policy is actually coming in and knocking out policies that are already in existence. And I feel like that's something that we don't really talk about that much, right? Is that a double slide? What did I do? Oh, that's what I did. Yeah, I got myself confused. Yes, okay. I said all that. So these are the teachers who engaged in test resistance and refused to administer the policy or the test that the district gave them. The district then came back and said, you don't have to take this particular test anymore. So it was a win for the teachers. I think it's important to highlight, and I may have already said this, but I just want to kind of repeat that they were doing it for the students, but they were also doing it for them. They were doing it for them because, as one teacher told me in a recent interview, I feel like I'm enacting child abuse. Right? The response that the students are having to testing is very dramatic. They talked about the testing harming the trust and belonging that they were attempting to build with the students, right? The kids like got into the country, they've been here for 3 months, all of a sudden they have to take this test, they can't do it, they feel like failures, and they're looking at us, right? We're the ones that have to take, are taking the responsibility for this kind of harmful thing that the kids are trying to get through. And there is some nuance, right? Not all teachers hated the testing, and we can talk about that, but in this particular case study, the school was very unanimous in trying to get this testing out. And one of the other interesting things that I found in this case study is that in the act of resistance, the teaching staff was united in a way that they really appreciated, right? So this was a staff that had had some issues and some problems, and it's a small school and they're doing tough work and things weren't always easy, but here they were able to come together as a community, right? So to center that kind of community. So I argue in this particular case study that teachers' policy resistance can be theorized as a method of making policy, that refusal is in fact a meta-commentary on the usefulness of policy to school communities. And elsewhere in an earlier piece I've argued that like external policymakers make policy and then they leave and they don't always come back to check and see how things went down. I also want to argue here that policy is something that is community negotiated, should be culturally relevant, and definitely needs to be context specific. And we've already talked about this piece that the external policies are knocking out the local policies already in place. So what can we say about these 3 projects and some of the things that I've talked to you about? I want to go back to this point and emphasize that the multilingual, hyperdiverse cultural context is everywhere, right? That it's not just in Los Angeles and New York, although it's immediately apparent there, right? It's very much in your face there, but that it is everywhere, and that we do need to populate research, right? We do need to populate, what we know about this particular kind of cultural context. I want to say that youth are learning a lot in new immigrant diversity, right? They are learning to belong across difference, they're learning to play linguistically and build meta-linguistic awareness, they're learning to apprenticeship, they're learning to peer teach, to expand their transcultural repertoires. And I think that this is important and subversive, and one of the things I want to point out to you is that I haven't really talked about this as an ESL classroom, right? And so that's a social justice, anti-racist strategy that I was taught as a graduate student. You don't always have to say, hey, here's what I'm doing, and here's how I'm being anti-racist. You can just go ahead and do it, right? Like, I'm just going to talk about this place and this space in a different kind of way to help you see the assets, to help you see the creative resources that exist in this space, right? So that's a strategy that I take very purposefully in my writing, right? So I have what I call my anger pieces, where I name racism, and then I have like my other pieces, where I'm just going to talk about the learning, that I'm going to talk about it around kids that you, and I'm referring specifically to Donald Trump, you think are possibly not worth anything, right? I also want to talk a little bit with you about how school programs and standardizing policies are not reflective of 21st century diversity, and ask where is culturally responsive policymaking, and that's something that a couple of friends of mine and I have been trying to get to in a recent piece, which I think is actually now out. And finally, I want to argue for empirical research, right? So we really need empirical research, and as I've tried to highlight by showing with you some of my own struggles around my methodological decisions, it's not easy to do this kind of work, right? And so we can think about how we grapple with the diversification of diversity, non-traditional racial and ethnic affiliations. I'm not sure if I love non-traditional, but I just kind of want to think about breaking out of the regular categories that we use to describe kids. I want to think about multilingualism, and then of course we have classroom teachers that are trying to address this. I love superdiversity as a framework, but I do struggle a little bit to think about how all this beautiful theory, how we are showing what superdiversity actually looks like. I want to think about how we can move beyond Spanish-English bilingualism, beyond that kind of, well, not move beyond, to continue to highlight that as important, and to add to that the discussions of the hyperdiversity that are within this frame. And also thinking about, if we stop thinking about immigrant, not immigrant, or native, non-native, or English speaker, something else speaker, how can we think about power, right? Because if we get rid of this like English-speaking native thing altogether and just think about the hyperdiverse context, certainly there's power issues that are existing right there in and of itself, right? And I've had a couple of conversations with folks today about, the kid who speaks Tagalog and she's the only one in the classroom, right? Or the fact that like in the current place where I am doing my research, it's like if you speak Spanish, you speak Arabic, right? You've got a large population of kids to work with, and you've got teachers that speak your language, but not if you're speaking Twi, right? Fulani, right? Like lots of different languages, some of which don't have script, so that's its whole own interesting literacy piece that we can get into. And then ultimately, kind of this overarching question that shapes me as a social justice researcher: how do we continue to uphold what we need in terms of racial reparations, but also engage with conversations around intersectionality, around the multis, around the bis, around the trans, right? So without in any way diluting what we need to do in terms of gaining political and economic rights. But it's not all bad, right? With empirical research, with this kind of work, there comes a lot of wonderful affordances. And we talked a little bit about flipping the script already, but we can really also think about these spaces for researchers to flourish, right? Researchers, just as kids are flourishing and doing interesting and creative work, how can doing this work push us as researchers to think innovatively about methods, think in different ways about power and knowing? How and what data sources do we collect to deeply reflect hyperdiverse classrooms? How are we dealing with those materials? How are we translating to transcribing them? How are we writing them up? What can we truly know? Part of the affordances of doing this work is having an opportunity to speak beyond just the standard research community. And this is a blog post that I wrote coming out of this past year of research on some tests, some standardized tests, and some things that I was seeing in the classroom. So this piece was shared, as far as I know, 15,000 times in 24 hours. I was getting emails from all around the country from professors saying, I'm teaching this tomorrow. My teachers, I've worked with some teachers in New York, brand new teachers in New York, and gave it to them, and like they've shared it with their colleagues, right? So what is the power of what, I do not consider myself an activist, but I do consider myself a scholar that supports activism. I support community organizing. My research can be in service of some of this work, and so thinking about both our research and how important it is to have that empirical work, but also important to have that public work as well. I did not pick that picture, the editor did. Oh, what's next? Well, got a lot going on, guys. So I'm gonna dig into this discourse analysis stuff. I'm really interested in some of Stanton Wortham's work on discourse analysis across different pathways. I'd like to do some archival work. I'd like to take a breath and take a moment, look across my data sources and begin to think about comparative ethnography and how we can think analytically across projects. I've been working on a book, ? I'm thinking about a teacher interviewing series, and possibly also Vassar is podcast happy right now, and so we've got like podcast people coming to campus, and we've been talking to them, so I'm thinking about podcasts and like interviewing skills and what, like if there could be some public overlap there. And of course, continuing to push into the kind of two areas that I care about very deeply in terms of research, which are the anthropology of learning and the anthropology of policy. And so with that, I thank you, and I welcome questions.